Jet Set Willie was the best-selling game in the UK in 1984, and it shipped with this elaborate grid of colours in an effort to prevent unlicensed copying. There were two problems though. First, it didn't work, and secondly, the game was uncompletable. So how did this game still top the UK charts for 3 months in a row, and leave a legacy that we're still talking about 40 years later? Here's how it was supposed to work. When you booted up the game, you'd be presented with a grid reference on that sheet and have to input the 4 colours that you saw in that cell. If you failed the first attempt, you'd get a second try, but if you failed the second try, then the game would completely reset your computer, forcing you to load the game again. In 1984, to reload the game, you'd literally have to rewind the tape to the beginning, restart your computer and play the tape back through. And this was an expensive process. Rewinding the tape took a lot of time, and then when you played the tape back through, you could only load at about 170 bytes per second, meaning that reloading the game from scratch took upwards of 3 minutes. So in principle, this wasted a lot of time if you didn't have access to the physical grid of colours. And at that time, the idea was that photocopiers weren't capable of photocopying documents that contained colours, and manually transcribing it would be too painful. Other games from that period used similar ideas. This document was printed on unphotocopyable paper, which still today can't be photocopied. And later games used the same idea, but with a more creative approach, using these code wheels that were kind of fun to interact with. Like this one from The Secret of Monkey Island, where you'd have to match a pirate that you saw on the screen to read off a code for a particular location. Unfortunately, like I said, none of these techniques actually worked, which I'll explain shortly. But first, let's talk about the massive impact that Jet Set Willie had on the UK gaming scene and the reason that people wanted to copy it in the first place. Jet Set Willie was the sequel to Manic Miner by Matthew Smith, which had been written by him at the age of 16 in only 8 weeks, which had already become the best-selling video game in the UK in 1983, so people were understandably excited about the sequel. Another 16-year-old also joined the development team to work on Jet Set Willie, Chris Cannon. So Jet Set Willie was essentially being built by this team of savant geniuses who were actually too young to become shareholders in the company that was publishing the games. Alan and Sue Matten, business people from Liverpool, led the company that would publish Jet Set Willie. And from the research that I've done, Matthew Smith and Chris Cannon don't have the nicest things to say about their experience working in this environment. Matthew Smith described the experience of making the game as 7 shades of hell, and that probably explains why it shipped with some game-breaking bugs. In this piece in Sinclair User in December 1984, the development environment is described as a zoo. Alan Matten says, "Let's go and see if they've cleaned the straw out of Matthew's cage." The zoo is an area of the building set aside for the programmers. And if Alan is the head keeper, Matthew is the star exhibit, the money spinner. The article goes on to say, "It is indeed a zoo. No matter how involved the conversation becomes, one is inescapably drawn back to it. Some people never leave the zoo. They know their job's on the line," says Alan. "People see everybody wandering around and think they're idle, but as long as they produce a program, we don't care how they do it. Some of them sleep here. Come on, Stuart, when did you last go home?" "Saturday," Stuart says. "Uncertainly, today is Tuesday." "They've all got keys," says Alan. "I haven't got a key," says Matthew. Now, I don't know how much of this is editorialized by the journalist and how much of this is true, but you've got to remember that we're talking about 16 and 17-year-olds that are producing the best-selling games in the UK. And this just doesn't seem like an appropriate way to interact with them. Alan even talks about acting as a barrier between Matthew and his fans, saying that Alan forged his signatures on signed papers to protect Matthew, I guess, from the people who enjoy his work so much. The other thing that comes out in this article is that Alan was very interested in protecting the money spinner, very interested in copy protection. He talks about manufacturing the game cassettes specifically in blue plastic because they were hard to get, so you could easily spot copies. And in fact, it was Alan who came up with the original idea for the colourful copy protection grid that we saw at the beginning of the video, even going as far as to file a patent for it in 1984. So Jet Set Willie was highly anticipated, notwithstanding the development environment that I just talked about. Inside the cassette for Jet Set Willie was an invitation to win a prize. The first person to complete the game would be awarded 6 champagne glasses, a case of Dom Perignon champagne, and a Jet Ranger helicopter would pick you up for the opportunity to meet Matthew Smith himself. So it was a shame that Jet Set Willie released with a bug that rendered it impossible to complete the game. The bug itself is really interesting. In those days, the memory that would display graphics on the screen was close to the memory of the code, and in this case, an arrow that was supposed to appear on the screen was actually given a position below the screen. So when the arrow flew in this late game screen, it actually flew through the code, overwriting other parts of the game. This is the sort of bug that would eventually be called a buffer overflow, but it just didn't have a name back then. Of course, Alan responded to this very sensibly, especially considering that the integrity of the prize was at stake. Oh, no, he didn't. Software Projects originally announced that this was a deliberate ploy to make the return journey through the house much more difficult. "Great, isn't it?" grins Alan. There's no such thing as a bug in the game. But in those days, the line between a player of a video game and a programmer was kind of blurred. I've said before that the way that they loaded code into a computer at that time was to play a tape through, but you could also manually input code, and a lot of the people that were playing these games were learning how to develop themselves. Ross Holman and Cameron Else figured out a solution for how to patch the game by pausing the tape player and entering a series of code values that would cause the arrow to appear in a different location and not overwrite part of the game. This routine will stop the chain of events which occurs the second you enter the attic screen and which causes instant death in the 4 famous locations. As a result of this, Ross Holman and Cameron Else won the original prize. This fix was originally published and circulated in computing magazines at the time, but software projects eventually took it on as the official fix and hired Cameron Else to work on ports of future games. But people weren't particularly happy about this resolution. In this editorial, Jaded and Disgusted says that they were crestfallen to hear the announcement that Jet Set Willie had some winners when the game on the shelf wasn't completable. The whole affair has left a sour taste. The only way to win was to cheat. There is enough dishonesty in the business with piracy without introducing impossible games with big prizes. You may think I'm a sore hypocrite, maybe I am, but there are 1,000 others all over the country on my side in what should have been a massive controversy. And that brings us back to copy protection. If it's so easy to patch the code of Jet Set Willie, it's obviously easy to patch the code of the copy protection too. In this editorial, Getting In describes how to bypass the copy protection, and it works exactly the same as the fix for the attic bug. You pause the tape, type in some code, start the tape again, and instead of being presented with the challenge for the copy protection, you go straight to the title screen. So that's the story of Jet Set Willie, its copy protection, the unwinnable prize, and the experience and legacy of Matthew Smith. After his horrible experience working on Jet Set Willie, Matthew Smith took himself out of the game development scene, but today he's back in Liverpool and working on new games.